In recent years, Canada's foreign policy towards Cuba has been characterized by silence and inaction on key issues such as the promotion of human rights and democracy. Since the pro-democracy protests in July 2021, the Cuban regime has intensified its repression, yet the Canadian government has not utilized its diplomatic and legal tools to address the situation. As part of the Human Rights Coalition, Democratic Spaces, the organization I preside, and human rights lawyer Sarah Tisch submitted questions to Canadian officials, including Deputy Prime Minister of Foreign Affairs David Morrison and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, concerning basically Cuba's ties to authoritarian regimes such as Russia and China, and the lack of engagement with pro-democracy activists in the island. Following Prime Minister Trudeau's statement that the Canadian embassy in Cuba should engage with pro-democracy activists, we wrote a letter to the Canadian ambassador in Cuba, Ms. Marianique Tremblay, urging her, based on the Prime Minister's sworn testimony at the Inquiry Commission in Ottawa, to meet with pro-democracy activists and independent journalists in Cuba. Supporting democracy in Cuba requires political will.
This is an opinion piece written by myself and Michael Lima. It was published in The Hub on July 13, 2022. And this piece opens with discussions about authoritarian alliances. We write here, besides Cuba's key authoritarian alliances with Russia and China, the Cuban regime has a disastrous record of human rights abuses. Cuba is one of the oldest dictatorships in the world, and the regime has increasingly cracked down on human rights defenders. Following the July 2021 pro-democratic protests, the Cuban regime jailed so many political prisoners that it now has more arbitrarily detained than Venezuela and Nicaragua combined. Given these gross and systematic human rights violations, in particular the long-standing nature of them, why is it that you believe that this different approach to Cuba, I'll call it, as opposed to China, continues to make sense if there doesn't seem to have been much improvement?
I'm not certain we have a different approach to Cuba than we do to China. We are, in both cases, concerned at the nature of their governance. We have made no secret about that. But as I tried to say in the beginning of my direct testimony, the essence of diplomacy is being able to have a dialogue with countries even when you don't agree with them. So we don't agree with some of the things that Cuba does. I already mentioned the detention of protesters that took place in the summer of 2021, and we don't agree with many of the things that China does. But the channels of diplomacy are open, and we believe that's the best way to serve Canada's interests.
We have primarily dealt in these hearings with regimes considered to be the major players, China, Russia, Iran, India. But of course, there are smaller dictatorships in the world that collaborate with these bigger players. And I raised an example of this in my cross-examination of Mr. Shortliff vis-a-vis Cuban state broadcasters replaying Russia Today programming in Canada. And indeed, Cuban human rights activists have flagged that Canada must address Cuban collaboration with the likes of China and Russia in order to comprehensively address the threats posed by those countries. Would you disagree with that assertion?
I think how we deal with every and any country in the world needs to be very alert to the context, alert to the potential pitfalls or dangers, but also the potential benefits to Canadians, and having a nuanced foreign policy that recognizes both challenges and dangers and opportunities is the hard work that the government does on an ongoing basis.
I understand that the Canadian government engages in dialogue with Cuban government actors. Another point that Cuban human rights activists have repeatedly made is that the Canadian government should also be meeting with pro-democracy groups in Cuba. Would you agree with that?
I can say from personal experience that I know we do engage and have engaged with pro-democracy groups all around the world.
Does that include in Cuba?
I believe so, but I would have to know. I'm not apprised on it in its latest forms, whether that's ongoing right now or not.
Okay, and if Canada does not engage with pro-democracy groups in Cuba, would you agree that Canada should?
It is part of the responsibility of every Canadian mission overseas to engage with civil society organizations and various actors, not just governments of any given country. So I am actually quite certain that Canada does engage with a range of civil society actors in Cuba, like everywhere else.
Okay, and not to hammer the point, but just I want to make sure I get this right. If it is the case that the embassy does not, do you agree that it should?
I have just stated that I believe that it is important for every mission around the world to engage with civil society in the country in which it's in a way that is appropriate for that context.
Okay, thank you. I have no further questions.